Sometimes I wonder if life has a way of teaching you the sharpest lessons right when you least expect them. Maybe that's why I'm telling you this. I need someone to understand, even if only in part, what it feels like to have your own blood turn against you. I spent my life building something my father started, a small manufacturing company that grew into a name people respected across the state. I thought I was careful with whom I trusted. I thought family meant loyalty. I was wrong. My eldest son David was always clever, charming, and insatiably ambitious. I watched him grow from a boy who admired my work into a man who believed he could do better. Except he didn't want to do better with me. He wanted to do it instead of me. At first I saw his ambition as admirable. I even encouraged it. After all, he was my son. But there's ambition, and then there's deception, and he had crossed that invisible line. It started with subtle shifts. Financial reports didn't quite add up. Investments seemed riskier than usual, and some funds had quietly vanished into accounts I didn't recognize. When I asked, David always had a plausible explanation: market fluctuations, high-return ventures, a temporary cash flow issue. I trusted him. I wanted to trust him. Then came the day I realized the truth. The family fortune, decades of work, every careful investment had been drained to fund a venture that was collapsing faster than I could comprehend. My own son had gambled everything we built on a dream that wasn't his to chase. Penniless, humiliated, betrayed, and yet, oddly, I didn't rage. Not yet. That came later. What I felt first was a hollow, cold quiet, a silence where love and trust used to live. I knew that my response had to be precise. Anger would only make me reckless. David had underestimated me, and he didn't realize that I'd been watching, learning, and quietly preparing my next move. I may be 65, my hair mostly silver, my hands no longer steady from years of labor, but I had something David didn't: patience. I was going to take back what was mine, piece by piece, and when the time came, the revenge would be quiet, devastating, and inescapable. It was the little things at first, the ones you almost don't notice until they pile up like dust in a forgotten corner. David started coming home later than usual, claiming meetings or urgent calls, though the gleam in his eye said otherwise. His confidence had shifted into something more dangerous, cocky, untouchable, as if he believed I'd never catch on. I began retracing every transaction, every meeting, every handshake. That's when I noticed the subtle patterns: offshore accounts, shell corporations, transfers masked as investments. Each one was a brick in the wall he was building between himself and me. My heart ached, not for the money, though its loss stung, but for the betrayal itself. I confronted him casually one evening, over a drink in my study, hoping to gauge his reaction. "David," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I've been reviewing the numbers, and something doesn't sit right." He smiled, leaning back as if I were joking. "What are you talking about, Dad? Everything's fine. You worry too much." It was the same line I'd heard so many times from employees, from friends, from partners, who tried to cover their mistakes with charm. But I wasn't an employee, and I wasn't a fool. "You're very confident," I said slowly, studying him. "But I know the truth about the accounts you've been moving, the investments that were never approved, the companies you created." His smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, like a crack in glass. But then he laughed it off, a little too quickly. "You've been watching too much TV, Dad. Relax. I'm trying to grow the company." I let it slide for now. My silence was louder than any accusation I could make. The tension in the room was a quiet storm, and I knew storms always break eventually. That night, I began making plans. Not loud, not impulsive. I had lost money, yes, but I hadn't lost my mind. David had underestimated the patience of a man who had built an empire from scratch, the patience of a father who had loved his son despite warning signs. I decided to watch, to wait, and to gather more than proof. I needed understanding. I needed to know why my own son thought he could betray me and walk away unscathed. Because if I was going to reclaim what was mine, and more importantly, if I was going to make him feel the weight of his actions, I had to know him completely. David didn't know that the next phase of his life would be guided by my quiet, unwavering resolve. He believed he was untouchable. And that was his first mistake. The day it all fully hit me, the day the reality of his betrayal crashed into my life like a freight train, is one I'll never forget. I was sitting in my office, going through the last few statements I had, when it became clear the accounts were not just drained, they were emptied. Every investment gone, every cushion we had built for decades erased. I stared at the numbers, my hands shaking despite years of experience with far larger sums. It wasn't just money, it was my life's work, my legacy, the trust I had placed in the son I raised. And that trust had been used as a ladder for him to climb higher while I fell. I went to find him. He was in the living room, relaxed, talking on his phone, as if nothing had happened. When he hung up, I held up the final statement, the one that proved everything. "David," I said, my voice steady, colder than ice. "This is all gone. Every dollar." He blinked, then laughed, a nervous, short laugh. "Dad, it's just temporary. It's part of a big move. Trust me, you'll see the return soon." I could see the strain behind his eyes, the flicker of panic, but I held my own expression like a mask. "Temporary?" I repeated, my voice low. "Do you know what it means to betray your father? To take everything we built together and throw it away for your own gamble?" He shifted uncomfortably. Dad, I just thought." "You thought," I cut him off sharply. "You thought I wouldn't notice? You thought I'd just sit here and watch as my own son destroyed everything?" For a moment the room was silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock, a cruel reminder of the years I had invested, now lost. I felt a tight knot in my chest, a mix of rage, grief, and disbelief. I had never imagined feeling so powerless, so violated by someone I loved. And yet amid the storm of betrayal, a strange clarity came. I would not let this end with despair. I would not scream or beg. David had made a monumental mistake. He had underestimated me, underestimated the depth of my resolve. I might have been penniless, humiliated, and heartbroken, thinking of every detail, every conversation, every subtle hint, every lie. I began sketching plans, not with the aim of recklessness, but with precision. David's arrogance would be his undoing. I would be patient, silent, and methodical. I would take back everything he had stolen, not just the money but the sense of power he thought he had over me. And when the day came, he would understand that betrayal is not just a transaction, it is a debt. And debts, no matter how carefully hidden, always come due. Humiliation is a strange, slow poison. It doesn't strike like anger or fear. It creeps, settles into your bones, and makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world and the people in it. That was how I felt in the weeks after discovering David's betrayal. Friends who once called to discuss deals now tiptoed around me, unsure how to speak to a man who had lost everything. Business partners I had trusted for decades suddenly found reasons to cancel meetings, to claim new opportunities elsewhere. Even my own employees treated me with polite distance, as if my downfall were contagious. I walked through my home one evening, the rooms echoing with emptiness, and felt the weight of the life I had built now fractured, like a mirror shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. David's laughter, once charming, now rang in my ears like a cruel echo. I realized he wasn't just ambitious, he was ruthless, and he had no intention of letting anything, least of all family loyalty, stand in his way. I tried to speak with him, to demand some recognition of the damage he had done, but he brushed me off, claiming that everything would work out, and that I was overreacting. Overreacting, the nerve of it. I wanted to scream, to shake him until he understood the magnitude of what he'd done, but I knew that would only feed his arrogance. So I withdrew. I stopped going to social events, stopped speaking to friends who had always stood by me. I wandered the streets of my neighborhood, late at night, feeling both invisible and exposed. The humiliation was not just about money. It was about the betrayal of trust, the shattering of family bonds, the realization that someone I had nurtured and loved could wield my own legacy as a weapon against me. Yet, amid that darkness, something quietly started to stir. Anger, yes, but tempered with resolve. Pain, yes, but sharpened into focus. I realized that humiliation is only permanent if you let it define you. And I would not let it define me. By the time the first month had passed, I wasn't just grieving, I was planning. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every smirk from David had been filed away in my mind, and I began to see the outlines of the path forward, not just to recover what was mine, but to remind him of the cost of betrayal. David believed he had stripped me of power. In reality, he had lit the spark of a reckoning he could never see coming. By the time I fully grasped the scale of David's betrayal, even my home, the sanctuary I had built with my own hands and memories, felt alien. The bank accounts were drained, investments vanished, and creditors started circling, sniffing weakness. I received letters I could barely bear to open, each one a reminder that my life's work had been hijacked. One morning, I walked into the office of our family estate manager, a man I had trusted for decades. His eyes avoided mine as he handed me the final notice, foreclosure proceedings on the property I had raised my children in, the home where my wife had passed years ago, and where David had grown up learning how to walk and talk under my guidance. I stood in the doorway, staring at the stately mansion that now seemed like a tomb of my own miscalculations. The furniture, the paintings, the photographs lining the walls, all of it belonged to someone else now, or perhaps more accurately, belonged to no one. My son had taken the heart out of it. I wandered through the empty rooms, each echoing with memories, the laughter of holidays, the warmth of quiet evenings in the study, the scent of my wife's cooking gone, swallowed by David's ambition and deceit. I felt unmoored, a man without anchor, as if the very foundation of my life had been pulled from beneath me. And yet, amid the loss, a quiet resolve began to harden. The pain was real, yes, but so was the clarity that came with it. I had been stripped of my wealth, yes, but not of my mind, not of my will, and not of my understanding of David. Every reckless move he had made, every careless boast, every lie, it was all a record for me to study, to understand, to use. Isolation settled over me, like a winter frost. Friends drifted away, unsure how to comfort a man who had lost everything. My remaining employees were hesitant, fearful of David's influence. I dined alone, slept in empty rooms, and let the silence press in, until it became a companion, a teacher, a quiet mentor whispering patience into my ear. It was during these long nights of solitude that I began to see the path ahead, not as a man lashing out blindly, but as a strategist who had been forced into exile by his own blood. Every detail mattered. Every misstep David had made would become a tool. And when the moment came, I would reclaim what was mine, not with brute force, but with precision, subtlety, and the weight of inevitability. The nights were the hardest, alone in my study, the house silent, except for the occasional creak of old floorboards. I confronted not just David's betrayal, but my own failures. Had I been too trusting, too lenient, too blind to the hunger for power growing inside my own son? I asked myself these questions over and over, and the answers were as uncomfortable as they were illuminating. I realized that my anger, though justified, would be useless if it consumed me. Revenge would require something more: patience, cunning, and above all, control. I had to master my emotions, or they would betray me as completely as David had. I began keeping meticulous notes. Every lie David had told, every shady deal, every moment he had thought himself untouchable. I traced the money, mapped the networks, and studied his patterns. He believed himself clever, but cleverness without foresight is nothing but arrogance, and arrogance is predictable. Isolation sharpened my mind, without distractions, without friends to temper or advise me. I could see with an almost surgical clarity the steps that lay ahead. I remembered lessons from decades in business: the value of leverage, the power of patience, the strength in seeming weakness while quietly preparing a decisive move. And I remembered something more personal, something far more dangerous: pride. David had taken my wealth, my home, my peace of mind, but he had not yet taken my pride. That was mine to wield, and I would wield it carefully. In these long hours, I also remembered moments of our past. My son as a boy, the way he would run to me after a scrape, the trust in his eyes. That trust had been shattered, yes, but it had left a trail I could follow. I would understand his mind as no one else could, and that understanding would become my weapon. The quiet became my ally. I walked through the empty halls of my home, visualizing the confrontation yet to come. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to act impulsively. David had underestimated me completely, and that was a mistake that would cost him dearly. In the darkness of my solitude, I felt something ignite, a spark of resolve that no betrayal could extinguish. I was still here. I was still thinking, and when the time came, I would strike in a way so precise, so inevitable, that David would never forget the consequences of crossing me. The first spark of resolve didn't come with fireworks or shouting. It came quietly, like the click of a lock sliding into place. I realized that if I wanted to regain what David had stolen, I couldn't act like a desperate man. I had to act like the father, the businessman, the man who had built empires from nothing. I began by gathering intelligence. Every transaction David had made, every partner he had spoken to, every person he had relied on for this venture. I started mapping it all. Not recklessly, not in a rush, but carefully, systematically. I wanted to understand the terrain before stepping onto it. Then I looked closer at David himself. Arrogant, impulsive, accustomed to taking the easy path when it served him. Every weakness. He had ego, impatience, overconfidence, became a point of leverage. I had raised him after all. I knew how he thought, how he justified his actions, how he convinced himself he was untouchable. I didn't just want to reclaim my wealth. That was only the beginning. I wanted him to feel the weight of his betrayal, not in anger, not in shouting, but in quiet, precise consequences that would leave him questioning every decision he had made. I wanted him to see that his father, the man he thought broken and powerless, was still far more formidable than he imagined. Money could be replaced, homes could be rebuilt, but pride, power, and reputation were far more fragile, and those were the things David had taken for granted. I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I began reconnecting quietly with allies from my past, trusted accountants, loyal former employees, old business partners who respected me, not for what I had, but for what I could do. I didn't tell them what I planned, only that I was preparing to make things right, and their loyalty returned in small, careful ways. At night I sat at my desk, reviewing the ledgers and notes I had made. The spark of resolve was becoming a fire, controlled but intense, burning, for the inevitable moment when David's world would shift, when the scales would tip, and he would realize that betrayal, no matter how carefully hidden, always leaves traces, and I would follow each one of those traces to its source, until every action he had taken against me came home in full. I keep a small notebook now. Nothing fancy, just a cheap spiral one. And I write things down the way soldiers mark coordinates. Precise, clinical. In the weeks after I decided I would not be undone, that little book became my map. Each name, each transaction, every odd handshake went into it. It was in that book that the past began to open up like a door I hadn't noticed before. I started with the obvious: ledgers, bank statements, corporate minutes. Those gave me numbers and dates, but numbers aren't motives. I needed motives. So I dug deeper into the softer, messier things people leave behind. Old emails, party photos, offhand voicemails. You'd be surprised how much people confess when they think no one's listening. In David's case, he'd been very loud about his certainty. So loud he'd forgotten to cover the tracks of who egged him on. That's how I found Claire. She wasn't on any official document, not at first glance. Just a friend, a consultant, a woman with a knack for sliding into dinner conversations and walking out with the blueprints of someone's life. There were pictures of David and her at a rooftop bar, laughing like conspirators. There were messages, not many, but the tone was intimate and corrosive. Congratulations, you're ready. Don't worry about the old man. Trust me. It's a pattern I recognized. David leaning on someone to justify the gamble he couldn't quite make on his own. Claire wasn't the villain in isolation. She was leverage, someone with ties to the very venture that swallowed our fortune. When I traced the emails, they led me to a name I'd only heard whispered in boardrooms: Marlowe Capital. A firm with appetite, connections, and a reputation for swallowing smaller players whole. David hadn't gambled alone. He'd partnered with wolves, and Claire was the shepherd. But what really cracked the case open was a box I found tucked behind old tax files in the storage room where we kept paper that was too important to throw. Inside were letters. Not legal documents, just paper that smelled faintly of printer ink and old smoke. One of them was from David to a man named Bennett Marlowe, written in a tone I hadn't expected, deferential, almost pleading. He promised returns that weren't there yet. He offered equity, personal guarantees, and most damning, an outline of how he'd shift family assets to secure Marlowe's involvement. Reading that letter felt like unpeeling him. It showed me the point where ambition had turned to compromise. He'd willingly offered our name, our credit, the company's foundation, to secure a seat at a table he'd only dreamed of joining. It was not just greed, it was the hunger to be seen, and the willingness to wear any cloak to be visible. There was another thing in the box, a small recording on a thumb drive, labeled David_confidential. I didn't know whether to listen, but I did. His voice was close, too close, excited, nervous. He was on a call with Claire and someone I later learned was Bennett. They spoke about accelerating timelines, liquidity events, and restructuring ownership. Bennett's voice was velvet around a blade. He promised rescue and demanded control. It was all laid out. David would bring the family assets into the structure. Marlowe would inject capital. They'd all walk away winners, except of course when the numbers didn't behave as promised. Knowing the players changed the game. Up until then I'd been angry at my son. Now I was angry at the ecosystem that fed him his illusions. It meant there were more routes to reclaim what was mine than a direct, futile confrontation with a man who still thought charisma could hide incompetence. If Marlowe had stakes, they had documents. If Claire had influence, she had fingerprints, and fingerprints can be followed. But as I traced those fingerprints, I found things about the family I hadn't wanted to see. There were choices my wife and I had made, investments we'd accepted, loans we'd co-signed, that had, inadvertently, made it easier for David to do what he did. That knowledge cut deeper than Bennett's promises. It forced me to admit that part of the ruin was my doing, not because I'd intended harm, but because I'd been complacent in the structures we'd built. The moral ledger was messy. I could make David pay and make the wolves scatter, but the collateral damage might include people who had only ever loved us. That thought sat heavy with me. Revenge, if it's not tempered by the clarity of what you're willing to lose, becomes another form of blindness. I had learned that lesson in business a long time ago. It was time I learned it in blood. So I shifted tactics. Instead of a frontal assault, I began setting quiet traps. I wrote letters, not angry, but pointed to a few old partners, reminding them of past obligations and hinting at irregularities. I made discreet calls to one or two bankers I trusted, people who owed me favors, not because of money, but because of respect. I hired in secret a forensic accountant, a young woman with a stubborn way of asking the right questions, and I let her loose on the records. The goal was not to humiliate David publicly. It was to build an airtight case, a sequence of dominoes that would fall in a precise order. And alongside the ledger work, I began to study David's psychology more closely. He loved speed and applause. He needed validation. He couldn't resist the certainty of being the smartest man in the room. Those traits would be the levers I'd use. I'd push where he expected not to feel the pressure. His pride, his reputation, his need for approval from his new peers. Make the crowd thin out, and his confidence would curdle. There were nights I caught myself listening for his footsteps in the hall, wanting nothing more than to confront him and pin him like an insect under my thumb. But I remained silent. The notebook on my desk grew thicker. The list of names lengthened. The plan, slow, suffocating, precise, took shape. I had uncovered the map of the betrayal. Now I had to decide how best to follow it without losing myself in the process. That decision would be the hardest, because part of me still wanted to reach out and save my son from the ruin he'd happily walked into. Another part wanted him to feel every inch of the fall. I was learning that revenge is not simply about making someone suffer. It's about restoring a balance that betrayal forces you to measure. Weeks passed, and the quiet work of preparation became my life. I moved carefully, almost invisibly, as if I were a shadow tracing David's every step without him knowing it. I reviewed contracts, mapped out timelines, and cross-referenced every email, every transfer, every whispered promise he had made. What I was building wasn't just a case, it was inevitability. I started contacting old allies, carefully, one at a time. There was Martin, a retired banker who had once admired my steadiness. He still respected me, and his memory of every ledger I had touched was a goldmine. Then came Eleanor, a former accountant, sharp as a tack, and no stranger to quiet manipulation. They didn't know what I was planning, and they didn't need to. All they needed to know was that I was back in the game, and that my oversight alone demanded attention. Meanwhile, David continued in his bubble of assumed invincibility. I watched from the edges, through reports, subtle inquiries, and the occasional offhand comment from mutual acquaintances. Every arrogance, every careless word, every boast about his network became another thread I could pull. The more he bragged, the tighter the trap became. I also began to probe David's psyche, subtly, through conversations that seemed casual, almost fatherly. I asked him about the venture, the investors, the schedules. I feigned concern. I offered advice. I even complimented his supposed ingenuity. All the while I listened, storing every inflection, every slip of confidence, every hint of desperation. He never suspected that each answer was another brick in the wall I was building around him. And then there was Claire. She remained a shadow in his life, orchestrating his moves and whispering in his ear. I began placing small, innocuous probes to test her influence. Casual questions to mutual contacts, a few pointed suggestions, dropped in conversation, and I started to see how tightly she and David were entwined. She wasn't just an accessory, she was a vector, a bridge to the wolves at Marlowe Capital. And every bridge, no matter how well built, has weak points. In the quiet of my study, surrounded by ledgers and notebooks, I allowed myself the occasional reflection. This wasn't about rage. This wasn't about immediate gratification. This was about precision, about taking what was mine, about restoring order in a world David had carelessly upended. I began to imagine the final reveal, the dominoes falling in sequence, the shock on his face when he realized that everything he thought was untouchable had been traced, accounted for, and anticipated. There were nights I dreamed of confrontation, of facing him directly, and I felt the old surge of anger. But I reminded myself, the moment for that would come later. Right now, patience was a weapon far sharper than any confrontation. Every misstep he made would be noted, every move anticipated. And when the day came, he would see that his father was not broken, not powerless, and not blind. The fire of resolve had turned into a cold, methodical strategy. I was no longer merely a victim. I was a man preparing for a reckoning, and every silent night, spent in planning, every careful calculation, was another step toward reclaiming what was mine, and teaching David the cost of betrayal in a language he could never ignore. It wasn't enough to understand David. I had to understand everyone who fed his arrogance. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that he hadn't acted alone. Every venture has its enablers, and David had surrounded himself with people who saw opportunity where they should have seen loyalty. Claire, for one, was more than a confidante. She was a strategist in her own right, advising him not just on deals but on timing, presentation, even personal image. Marlowe Capital, meanwhile, was playing a careful game. They didn't care about David's ego or his father's legacy. They cared about leverage, liquidity, and eventual control. David's charm had opened doors, but the wolves behind those doors were the ones moving the pieces. I started quietly reaching out to former associates of Marlowe, people who owed favors, or were tired of the relentless hunger of corporate predators. Without revealing my hand, I asked questions about partnerships, about obligations, about the small cracks in the deals David had made. Each conversation added layers of understanding. I discovered that Marlowe had overextended in several directions, that Claire had misrepresented her influence to David, that David's friends in the venture were more self-interested than loyal. The beauty of betrayal is that it leaves evidence. Every false promise, every manipulated ledger, every whispered reassurance became a thread I could follow. By the time I had compiled a full picture, I realized that David was balancing atop a fragile tower of deceit. One misstep, one exposure, and it would all crumble. But the most valuable discovery was psychological. David's partners were motivated by greed, but also by fear. Fear of losing capital, fear of reputational damage, fear of being outmaneuvered. That fear could be directed, nudged, amplified. Claire could be isolated. Marlowe's overreach could be exposed. And David, in his own arrogance, would fall precisely where I wanted him to. I began sketching scenarios in my notebook. Not chaotic, not emotional, but strategic. Who could be quietly warned? Who could be subtly undermined? What legal or financial instruments could be leveraged, all without revealing my presence? It was like preparing a chessboard, knowing the exact moves my opponent would make before they even touched a piece. I understood that timing was everything. David thrived on speed and spectacle. He liked to believe that momentum was power. I would invert that principle. I would move quietly, deliberately, letting him push forward until the moment was ripe. The collapse would not be sudden. It would be inevitable, a tide that had been building in silence. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, I felt the thrill of control return. Not over money, not over property, but over the outcome itself. I would reclaim what had been taken, yes, but more than that, I would ensure that David understood the precision, the inevitability, and the quiet weight of a father who had been wronged. And in that understanding, he would finally see the true cost of betrayal, not just in dollars, but in dignity, in trust, and in the unshakable patience of a man who had once been blinded by love. Sometimes the memories hit me when I least expect them. I'll be sifting through statements, tracing a transfer, and suddenly I'm 15 years old again, watching David take his first tentative steps across the living room carpet. He stumbled, I caught him, and he laughed like the world was nothing but joy. That laughter, that trust, seemed impossible to reconcile with the man who had siphoned our fortune. I remember his mother, long gone now, sitting at the kitchen table, carefully balancing the bills while humming a tune that always made the house feel safe. We were partners, yes, but more than that, we were a family. The foundation of loyalty, of shared dreams, of patience and sacrifice was real. It wasn't perfect, of course, but it was ours. And then there were the first cracks. David's ambition didn't surface. All at once, it began as harmless pride, a desire to take on bigger projects, to stand out. I remember smiling at him, encouraging him, proud. I thought I was guiding him. Little did I know that the guidance was planting seeds that would one day grow into this towering betrayal. I recall the first time I suspected something was amiss. It was subtle, a misstatement in a report, a hesitation when discussing an account. I confronted him gently at the time, giving him the benefit of doubt. That's the trap of love. You forgive too easily, excuse too often, and you blind yourself to patterns that, if acknowledged early, could have been stopped. I also think of the moments of connection that now feel tainted by irony. Fishing trips in the summer, late-night talks about responsibility, even the small disagreements over trivial matters, all reminders that the bond was once alive. And true, the same bond he had now weaponized. These flashbacks are painful, but they're also instructive. They reveal the blueprint of his character, the flaws he has leaned into, and the ways he could be anticipated. The boy who once stumbled into my arms is the man who stumbles into his own overconfidence, and I have the benefit of hindsight and the patience that comes with age. As I navigate this quiet war, I understand that revenge is never just about punishment. It's about justice in the only form that matters to someone like David, the form that confronts him with the consequences of every choice, every lie, every betrayal. He thought he could hide behind charm and audacity. Memory sharpens strategy. Love once betrayed becomes the lens through which every misstep is magnified. And as I sit with these recollections, I feel something settle deep inside me, a solemn promise that what was broken will be addressed, that betrayal will not go unanswered, and that the son who once trusted my guidance will finally understand the weight of every lesson I tried to teach. They came one by one, the allies I hadn't known I'd need, until I needed them. None of them owed me blind loyalty. They owed me respect, and in my case, respect was worth more than money. When a man loses both fortune and face, people who respect him don't cling to pity. They listen for reason. I gave them reason. First was Martin. He showed up with 2 black coffee and a look that said he'd been waiting for me to wake up. He'd been a banker. For 40 years, new ledgers like other men, new faces, and he'd never liked the taste of Marlowe Capital. Those boys move fast. To cover slow thinking, he said, and then, more quietly, tell me where to look. I handed him a photocopy of a letter, watched his fingers feel for the angle that would make the lie show its teeth. He found it in 3 minutes. Eleanor was next. She'd worked for me in the early days, sharp enough to make rivals think twice, and loyal enough to keep confidences. She brought with her a quiet ferocity and a list of firms that often acted as conduits for the kind of deals that had eaten us alive. You didn't lose to luck, she told me. You were fenced in. That word fenced sat in my chest like a promise. If we could find the gaps in the fence, we could get back through. Then there was the youngest of the group, Marisa, the forensic accountant I'd hired. She had hands that didn't tremble when she worked, and a mind that liked puzzles in a way that was almost religious. She came with a laptop and a stubborn way of asking the right questions. The first night she stayed late. She tracked an apparently innocuous payment through 3 shell companies and found a residuary account in a name that matched, a subsidiary of Marlowe. She frowned, then whispered, "They forgot to launder it into someplace clean." I laughed then, a short, private sound, because even in the dark, the ledger gave me back a sliver of myself. New clues emerged. In the strangest places, an ex-employee, nervous and ashamed, slipped me a USB in a paper bag outside a diner. He'd once been David's IT guy and had left quietly when things started going sideways. On the drive home, I didn't look at it. By the time I unlocked my study door, my heart was beating a steady rhythm I hadn't felt in months. The files on that stick were simple drafts of emails, a calendar invite with a location and time, a scanned receipt for an expensive bottle of wine, at a dinner where David and Bennett had apparently toasted the future. It was small evidence, almost trivial, but it proved coordination, and coordination is the thing you can expose. We began to act, not loudly, not with threats, but with movements that would unsettle people who built empires on certainty. Martin made a few phone calls that sounded like friendly checks, and ended up with a cold pause on the other end of the line. Eleanor drafted a careful letter to one of Marlowe's quieter partners, outlining potential regulatory issues with a tone so professional it felt like a scalpel. Marisa traced transactions until the map of the conspiracy was sharp enough to show edges. I didn't want public ruin. I wanted leverage. Reputation is a currency, and in our world it spends as well as dollars. We started cutting threads, not snapping them all at once. A whispered question here, a quietly filed request there, an anonymous tip to a regulatory office in another state. Each action took away a little of the smugness my son hid behind. It was slow, and sometimes painfully so. But each small tug revealed how brittle the structure had been. And there were human things, too. I found Claire's number among a stack of receipts and called, pretending to be someone else, a concerned investor, thinking loud and asking soft. Her arrogance slipped. When she thought she'd been found out, she responded to fear the way most predators respond to a larger predator, with a prick of panic. In that panic, she let something fall. A name, an address, a casual detail that connected her more tightly to Bennett than she'd shown. I tucked that detail into the notebook beside David's many sins and felt my resolve deepen. But with each advance came a weight of conscience. I kept finding evidence of collateral damage, employees whose pensions had been caught up in the sweep, vendors who depended on contracts now in limbo. Revenge, I reminded myself quietly at night, was not the same as justice. I wanted the scales to tip back toward me, yes, but I did not want to break everything in the process. That thought tempered some of my moves. It made me choose stops where damage could be contained. One night, after Eleanor and I reviewed a contract that revealed yet another misrepresented clause, I sat on the porch and watched the street lamp spill its light on the driveway. The house felt less like a tomb and more like a fortress being rebuilt, brick by patient brick. My allies were not soldiers in uniform. They were people with memories of better things, and they moved because they believed in a man they'd once known to be steady and fair. That belief was a resource I had underestimated. The traps were set. The threads were carefully pulled so that when the time came, the collapse would be directed toward the right people. David might still be playing at the front of the stage, dazzling the crowd with charm, but backstage the ropes were being loosened. And for the first time in months, I slept without the ache that had lived in my chest. It was not peace, but it was preparation. In the morning, Marissa called from her small office, with a voice that trembled a bit on the edges. "There's movement," she said. "They're shifting funds again, trying to mask transfers. It's sloppy." I smiled, though the smile was thin. Sloppiness is the enemy of arrogance. Sloppiness leaves fingerprints. We had a window. The dominoes were lined up. The question was not if they would fall, but when, and whether I would let them fall. In a way that took everything down, or in a way that delivered a precise lesson to the son who had thought himself untouchable.